Hello, and welcome to our latest interview. This really is focusing on questioning and inquiry, and we're so thrilled to invite Trevor MacKenzie to the conversation. And he's going to start thinking and growing our understanding of how to sustain an inquiry in the classroom. Trevor is a high school English teacher, grades 9 through 12, but he also is an author of now 2 books, so congratulations on that second one, as well as a speaker and consultant. So welcome, Trevor.
Thank you, friends. I'm so excited to finally, get together and make this work. It's kind of been in the works for a while, so thanks for hosting, and I look forward not just to sharing, but learning alongside you both and with your network here in our collaborative network, so I'm excited.
Fantastic. So let's dive right into it. I know that you truly believe in the power of essential questions. So can you first start talking about what is an essential question and how do you leverage those to launch an inquiry process?
Yeah, essential questions are what frame our learning environment, ecosystem, experience. And those are those big, open-ended, driving questions that are going to guide our learning experiences. Essential questions for me frame units of study. Essential questions for me are activities that we do with our students to have them be the creators of questions. And that's a shift in their role in learning. Oftentimes students enter the inquiry classroom having been used to being given questions and not asking questions. And so that's a change in the role of the learner that transition, if you will, that I really try to mindfully support. And essential questions, somewhere in the inquiry classroom, students are going to start asking those essential questions to shape units of study that they design with my support. And that's where I take on much more of a guiding inquiry and guiding facilitator approach in the inquiry pool. So essential questions are critical. If I were to ask teachers to take on one big challenge in adopting more of an inquiry approach, it would be to begin learning with that essential question.
So you say that you get them to design essential questions and then they begin to develop their own inquiry approach. Do they depart from the unit of study that you already have defined, or are you really saying that they're kind of within the boundaries of the curriculum that you've designed?
Yeah, absolutely. They're within the boundaries of our curriculum in the classroom, the community curriculum. But students have ownership over, identifying the learning objectives, the standards that they're meeting, and also the performance tasks, the assessment piece. So students, when they are designing those essential questions, they really are taking on much more agency in learning and overlearning than in earlier on in the year. So I tend to do a lot of really explicit modeling of what essential questions look like, what they sound like, what those question stems are that essential questions can begin with. And through that modeling and through demonstrating my thinking and being very intentional, I should say, with that modeling, my students are creating those skills so they can ask those essential questions that will frame those units of study that they design.
So when I'm also thinking about what you're saying so far, it really dovetails nicely with the idea of creating more of an opportunity for student voice in the classroom, as well as co-creation. So when you're starting to have students be able to articulate their questions, what kinds of questions do they typically initially develop? And how might you grow, deepen, expand them as part of the process?
Yeah, as we all know, relationship is so important in learning, isn't it? And so really, I spend a lot of time getting to know my students and their interests and their passions and their curiosities. And that looks like many things. That looks like student-centered conferencing. That looks like, journaling and reflecting and me really spending time reading those and getting to know my students, more deeply. That looks like just asking them, like, what are your interests? What are your curiosities? And it also looks like sharing my own. I want my passions to be on display for my students so they can see what someone who is really excited about learning and a topic or an objective, what that looks like. So by the time my students are crafting their own essential questions, I have a fairly good understanding of where their interests are, where their curiosities are, and where their passions are. And so I've mentioned several times, I'm really explicit in that instruction and in that sharing. And those are pieces that I scaffold throughout the whole year. So by the time we get to that guided inquiry, free inquiry experience, students not only have seen and heard me share my understanding and my passions and my interests, but we've worked towards that essential question and identifying what that passion or focus point for their unit of study will be. So that looks like many different things to many different students. And that's not me trying to wiggle my way out of the question. That truly is a skill of the inquiry teacher, is how can we guide our students in a highly personalized manner. So what the needs are of one student and how I meet those when I'm working with that student, I turn around and I work with another student, it's going to look quite different because the needs of that student are quite different. So really honing my skill set around guiding questions and not just spoon feeding direction and answers to my students. I think that's something that I've really tried to be very focused on in my practice, and then communicating those guiding questions with my students so they understand that this is how we operate. And Mr. MacKenzie's got my back, he's in my corner, but he's not just going to give me the easy route to the answer per se.
So often the question that we get asked, so just role play it out for a moment. So you say, so I'm really interested and I'm curious to know what are the kinds of things that you're interested in. Here are some of the things I'm interested in, which is really a translation in a very reduced way of how you build those relationships. And the kid says, I don't know, nothing much interests me. Yeah, it's interesting that you're like that, but hey, I don't know what I care about. What do you do with that?
Yeah, I hear that from students often, and we can't blame them. I think, we've asked them to participate in an educational model that hasn't fostered or celebrated those interests that they naturally have and they come to school with. And so to shift the game on them so drastically, we can't fault them. I really do focus on and modeling out loud with students when I know a student does have a passion or an interest or a curiosity, and I'll stop the whole class and I'll model that conversation with that student, just as you and I were role playing. We're not taking on the role, we're just lifting up the conversation so everyone in the environment can hear what that sounds like. And I'll ask really, specific questions. Well, why is that topic meaningful to you? Can you tell me more about that? And that narrative that students will share and the Velcro as to why they're learning or that topic is very important to them, I want other students to hear and see so they can start to process what it will be like for them. And also, I've become a bit of a hoarder, a collector of these artifacts that students share of what learning is meaningful to them. So I could share those artifacts with my students so they could see what it looks like. So I'm in my classroom right now doing this interview. I'm looking around the room. In this corner, I have a totem pole that a student carved out of a big 8-foot piece of beechwood here in beautiful Victoria. British Columbia, Canada. That's an artifact that I will share with my class so students can understand the spectrum of possibility that we truly are operating under. I have paintings on the wall, I have photographs on the wall, I have graffiti art on the wall. So my artists can see what that Velcro looks like, and then they could start to create understanding. So, Ben, the example you gave of those students who are disconnected, who genuinely don't have a passion, those are the students who need that Velcro and that role play to be, obviously visible and heard. They're the ones who need it the most.
So one of the interesting parts is that when you're trying to grow students' capacity to develop and pursue questioning, there are other aspects that you said quite casually that are absolutely imperative to your classroom practice. So you sort of casually said, oh, because I do conferencing and because I give students time and space to do a deep dive into the questions. Let's play with that for a minute or two. So if you're going to make inquiry come alive in a classroom, what in your mind are primary instructional practices that not only support but also potentially enable an inquiry mindset to happen for a student?
Yeah, and these are understandings that I've honed over time. None of these changes came overnight, and I think that's what teachers who are looking at personalized learning and inquiry need to definitely stay focused on is we want our 4-year, kind of 5-year dream of what learning looks like in mind, but we're going to take those small steps to making that dream a reality. So, initially I said that I think the most powerful adoption we can make is focusing on essential questions and the teacher modeling those essential questions, and then going through a questioning routine with our students to slowly scaffold towards having them be essential question creators and askers. I think that's a critical piece. I think I definitely know my curriculum really well. I know I'm the professional in the room. I know my curriculum like the back of my hand. But what I'm trying to do is have my students' curiosities and interests come to my curriculum. And that's not nebulous, that's not nuanced, that's not uncertain. I can identify those curiosities that my students have and know where they connect to the prescribed learning outcomes or the objectives or the standards. And my job is to make those connections really clear for my students so they can see that their curiosities have a place in my classroom. I don't quote unquote cover content. I definitely want my students to discover content. I think content is critical for deep inquiry. The jargon and the language around a specific discipline or teaching area, those pieces are critical for us to go deeper into inquiry and to deepen understanding. I think, closed questions and quote unquote content get a bad reputation. I think those are the first questions we need to ask for deeper essential questions to be explored. Student conferencing, I can't tell you enough about how powerful student conferencing can be in the inquiry classroom. Even if it's a 2-minute check-in or a 10-minute check-in, I really try to take time off the table. I always refrain from saying we're having 5-minute conferences and when the 5-minute dinger goes up, our conference is done, because students feel like I'm not giving them the respect that their inquiry and their questions really do deserve and their needs deserve. So I try to take time off the table, and in doing so, I can more powerfully differentiate for each of my students that I'm working with one-on-one. So when I mean I take time off the table, I'll schedule the whole block for student conferencing, and my students are on task because they know that their time is coming to work one-on-one with me. So those are just a few really explicit ways that I could work towards those structures that we're adopting in the inquiry classroom. Yeah.
And as I listen to you, I also observe, and I think that, I've really been very much attentive to habits of mind and to those dispositions that really lend themselves to people having the mindset to do this work. And so one of the mindsets that I think is paramount to this is questioning and posing problems, being willing to lend your mind to the kinds of questions you have. But what I'm observing as I'm listening to you is you are that kind of person and you have that disposition because you are curious enough about your learners to want to know what's on their minds. And that's you as a questioning and posing problems person. So talk a little bit about how you as a teacher model and develop those kinds of questions, because you know how important it is to model that disposition.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that point because, a lot of my work initially in inquiry focused on the structures and the processes that we can adopt to really leverage personalized learning and inquiry. And what I've realized over the years is that the first and foremost, I guess you could say barrier to ensuring inquiry is successful, it is the teacher in the room. If the teacher isn't modeling inquiry and modeling their questions and modeling those habits of mind, that is going to be the first barrier to ensuring that inquiry is successful and powerful and deep. So definitely, as you can see the images behind me, these are images from my books, from my work, and these are images that my students all see in the classroom. These are images that are in their binders or they're on their blogs, and we refer to them often to give our students that visual Velcro, again, that understanding of where we are going to go, and as reflection points as we're going. And I think that formative piece as we are going through inquiry is really important with our students. So early in the year, I'm modeling my questions. I'm modeling my resource selection. I'm modeling, definitely how the little bits add up to the performance task or get us to the performance task. But also I'm modeling my feelings. I'm modeling that social emotional bit of the anxieties I'm feeling, the uncertainties, my confidences or my strengths, but also, my perceived weaknesses in inquiry and how I'm working towards managing those and honing those and elevating those. So later on in inquiry, there's much more of a balanced learner when we are introducing more agency over learning. And again, that's been a big light bulb that's gone off in my inquiry practice, is the power of that social emotional bit. Asking my students how they're feeling in inquiry gives me a much clearer assessment of how I can better support them in moving forward.
Well, one of the other attributes that Benna and I have developed is around self-discovery, and the notion of what you're describing right now, especially not just the social emotional piece, but really starting to pay attention to how did this inquiry benefit me? It's not just surrounding the content territory, but also how did I become more retrospective when I looked at the information or the ideas that I uncovered? In what ways are there strategies or approaches that I can start relying on? What habits have I outgrown? Talk a little bit about the role of reflection in your classroom around inquiry.
Yeah, so I teach in British Columbia, Canada, and we have a new revised curriculum here in BC. And, inquiry is just dripping from this new curriculum. I just feel so validated that, as a governing body of education, we are recognizing the role of the learner in the classroom. It's really powerful stuff. What's been really neat are the focus on the core competencies, as we refer to them, and having our students reflect on these core competencies in learning, both before learning, during learning, summative piece. That reflection piece is a part of our curriculum now, and I just can't tell you how exciting that is. That used to be an add-on to assessment, or that used to be an add-on to practice, and now it is pivotal, it's foundational that we have our students reflect throughout the learning process. And so we're at an exciting time in British Columbia trying to figure out what those reflection tools look like, and how we can really leverage them to have students show meaningful growth over time. And these reflection tools, some of them I've been using my entire career because I've been so focused on the needs of the individual rather than the collective or the whole, and being too much of a content-driven teacher. I love pushing out, a Google form is a really easy reflective tool, but it has to focus on the details that matter. How are my students feeling with these core competencies? What's the evidence that they're collecting to demonstrate growth? And what are their goals long-term? And how do we know that they're working towards achieving those goals? And when the student voice is a part of that assessment process, my assessment is much more clear, much more powerful, and much more meaningful. We're very blessed, as I said, in British Columbia, that there's been this shift, this validation to allow our teachers, our educators here to take some of those risks. Going back to the dispositions of the inquiry teacher, that would be one. We need to take risks. We need to have a little bit of fearlessness that I know what I'm doing is right for students, and I'm going to empower them more in this process of assessment.
Yeah, because I think what you're asking from your pool image is you're all jumping into the pool. It's not just the kids.
Absolutely, Benna. And that's part of the modeling process, isn't it? We want our students to see us taking risks, to be passionate about our teaching. And students love to be around passionate teachers. It's undeniable. We walk by those classrooms every day where the door is open and the energy is just palpable. Students want to be around teachers who are passionate about their craft and constantly questioning, how can I better meet the needs of my students? How can I empower them? And being really explicit with those structures and processes that we're adopting to empower them with our students, so they understand this different learning environment that they're now a part of. A lot of my work focuses on, when I consult or when I provide workshops, focuses on that transition from, I guess you can say, the teacher-centered classroom or the teacher-driven classroom, and transitioning into the student-centered classroom and the inquiry classroom. And how could we help our students transition most successfully from the former to the latter?
So when you're thinking about the mindset that you're cultivating in your students, so you talked about taking responsible risks, and you talked about questioning and problem posing. Are there other dispositions that are absolutely invaluable in what students need to continue to cultivate so that they can engage in maybe the murkiness of the inquiry process?
Yeah, and first and foremost, these dispositions or characteristics, these aren't, pieces that we expect students to enter the classroom with. These are definitely pieces that we can nurture, that we can help students identify, and that we can, work towards growing and elevating and honing. So, right away, reflection comes to mind. I think, a particular disposition or piece of the inquiry classroom that I ask all of my students to participate in, and this has come up throughout the interview here, is the power of reflection, both in terms of how we're doing as a collective, but how are we doing as an individual? How are we feeling? How are we working towards these goals that we've set out for ourselves? How are we working towards these being met? Am I growing? How do I know I'm growing? And if not, how can I change this pathway to better meet my needs? And again, we talk about differentiation. I think I'm better able to meet the needs of all 30 students in the inquiry classroom than not in the inquiry classroom, because I'm working more closely with my students, elbow to elbow, side to side, through those conferences and through those reflection tools, those pieces. So, reflection definitely comes to mind. And again, I think the characteristic of the inquiry classroom and personalization is really personally working with the students. And so what are the dispositions that they value as their strengths? And what are the ones that they want to hone or have identified as pieces that they want to elevate or sharpen? And that truly is personalized learning, isn't it? When the student is identifying the goal or the objective, and then we are helping them with the pathway to meeting that growth and having that be something that is measurable and achievable. Those are three pieces that I ask my students in all inquiries. Number one, is it meaningful to you? And if it's not meaningful to them, we're not exploring it. That truly is the Velcro. It has to be meaningful to them. And that is the job of the inquiry teachers, to recognize those curiosities and interests and passions and being able to bring those to the curriculum. So it has to be meaningful for my students. It has to belong in our ecosystem of whatever classroom or discipline we're working in. A physics inquiry must belong in the physics classroom, or the math inquiry must belong in the math classroom. Inquiry doesn't all of a sudden break down the walls to your teaching area and say, oh, now you have to teach history in the chemistry classroom. You're a chemistry teacher, so demonstrate chemistry inquiry. And then the third piece is it has to be achievable, right? These goals students are setting for themselves, we want them to be able to achieve these goals in the time allotted for our inquiry. A great example that I refer to time and time again is in a 2-month inquiry, I had a student who was working on writing a novella. And I never had a student embark on such an ambitious goal, 140-page narrative. And as an English teacher who's also a writer, I knew the undertaking she was taking on. And so I looked at her plan, I looked at her characteristics, her strengths, and her challenges. And through the student conferencing, it became pretty clear that this student could achieve this goal. And my job was to empower her through this process and help her reflect throughout the process to ensure that she was on track to meeting this goal. What happens now is I'll share this artifact, this novella that the students successfully wrote with other classes now. And students will undeniably get inspired by the novella and they'll want to take it on again. And I have students who haven't stepped up to that caliber or that challenge that initial student had successfully met. And it's through the reflection and the process and the student conferencing that we've realized that goal isn't going to be met. Does that mean learning isn't successful because they haven't written a novella? I argue that my formative assessment and support of those students was so powerful that I didn't need the summative piece. I didn't need the polished novella at the end of the unit to be completed. So, achievable, defined, it looks like many things in the inquiry classroom. It doesn't have to look like a polished summative piece is what I'm trying to say.
Trevor, what you said, it's been so powerful to the viewers on both learning personalized and habits of mind. And I know that you're gracious enough to provide a couple of the concrete examples or illustrations that are right behind you, your magical sketch notes. So thank you so much in advance for doing that. And again, any final words you want to say before we sign off together?
Really briefly, I just want to reference my artist, and she's the co-author of my new book, Inquiry Mindset. Her name's Rebecca Bathurst Hunt. So she's the artist behind all of these lovely images. Inquiry isn't a linear model. It's not this, point A to point B to point C. Although there's a lot of structure and process, an example such as this, the roadmap of the inquiry process, or over here we've got the plan and pitch process, and it gives the appearance like it's a checklist. really the power comes in that student conferencing where I'm working with my students one-on-one and being comfortable in those student conferences, knowing that my other students are on task and that the power of working with my students one-on-one, it has to be leveraged. I have to dedicate that time in order to ensure that this meaningful personalized learning experience happens. So in closing, ladies, thank you for giving me the time to share and to collaborate and learn with you. I appreciate it. And I can't thank you enough.
Well, the feeling's mutual. And again, you're modeling what a contemporary learning partnership looks like in real time in the classroom. So we couldn't be more thrilled to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to hear your passion, your ideas, and the way you've taken them, you've made them real, and you continue to, as we would say, remain open to continuous learning. So thank you. You're awesome.
Thank you, friends.